Well, I wasn't very interested in Joan of Arc at the beginning at all. She seemed to me too much of an anomaly, a teenage girl who went off to fight and change the 100 Years' War. And then I saw some films in 1999, some bad ones and some good ones, but Leelee Sobieski's portrayal really kind of made me think, this girl could be more interesting than I thought. And so from that I realized, looking in the library, that there were more original sources from the period about Joan of Arc than almost any medieval figure, including kings and queens. The typical portrayal of her is someone who is just a force of God or a force of the saints. And when I started reading the documents, because we not only have her own voice at trial, but we have the villagers, the soldiers she fought with, who testified 25 years after her death about her, and these are normally voices that are completely silent in the historical record. And they talked about her, and for example, the villagers in particular would say things like, oh, well, she didn't want to dance with us. We made fun of her a lot. And that struck me as odd because she got the town a tax exemption after all. And so my students were able to bring to that the idea that maybe she was a little bit bullied as a girl. And we do know from the sources that at around the age of 16, when she left home for the first time, her family household had become very repressive. Her brothers were tattling on her about the fact that she was going off and talking to people in other towns. And her father threatened to drown her if she went off to war. So they tried to marry her off. And Joan actually went on her own and fought a marriage contract and won. And so she was not the fun-loving girl. She was more than average pious. She would go on little pilgrimages to places and, again, was a little bit odd according to the local people. But she got her way. She went on 2 separate missions, if you will, to see the captain to try to get him to send her to the Dauphin, which is the heir to the King of France. And it was only after a 3rd interview with the Duke of Lorraine, and at that point he gave the go-ahead for her. They had a very, very mixed kind of interview because he wanted things she didn't want to give, like healing him and so forth, and she said, get rid of your concubine. One of the things I feel as a historian is that I have to feel the places that I study, and so I tried to trace all of Joan's footsteps, not on horseback, but either going to all of the places she went, staying in them, and trying to get a sense of the kind of journey she made. She went 11 days through enemy territory controlled by England or Burgundy just to get to the future king. And so the fact that she was willing to do that as a 17-year-old girl is astonishing to me. And once she was given the seal of approval after the many examinations, both theological and gynecological even, to make sure she was pure and a good Catholic, she was finally fitted with armor, which, by the way, I've tried on versions of it myself, and it's astonishing that a 17-year-old girl could wear armor, sit on a horse, have a standard, and so forth. And I think that's all they wanted her to do, that she would frighten the English that way, because they'd been besieging Orleans for about 6 months at that time. And so when they finally got Joan ready to go, she looked the part. She already had been very outspoken and even sassy in her responses to them. And so they finally sent her. And so it was about February of 1429 when they decided to outfit her for war. April 29th, they sent her to Orleans. She'd been chomping at the bit. People who saw her said she was like a woman in labor, waiting to have a baby. She wanted to get to war. And I think that's one of the most prominent characteristics of Joan. She loved warfare. She's not this crying saint. She's a woman who is full of action, full of self-confidence, and really wants to do what all of the king's men had not been able to do before this. And that was, they were so, quote, chivalrous, they were giving gifts to the English and so forth. Joan wanted to be at the English, and I think she had a vision that was very far ahead of its time in the sense that she imagined a France that wasn't just dynastic factions fighting amongst themselves, but there was actually one France. So it doesn't happen during her lifetime, but I think she starts creating that idea. And so she fought. The siege of Orleans was lifted in the week after she arrived. Then men started massing to the king's army because they were following Joan. They won several more victories with Joan actually insisting on being a warrior and a leader, making major decisions that could have gotten her in trouble. I first went to Domremy, which is where Joan was born, and it was a frontier town in her own day. It's now got only about 160 inhabitants. It was a little bit larger in the Middle Ages because it was on a trade route with Burgundy, but it's very small feeling. And you get the sense when you're there that Joan was a very big fish in a little pond. And again, her actions later on, both in warfare and also in just speaking to enemy judges or theologians, shows that she really wasn't afraid of anything, including her own family. So I think she wanted to get out of Domremy, so she went to Vaucouleurs, which is about 8 miles to the north of Domremy. She lied, by the way, to get there, and in many times in her lifetime, short lifetime, she lied to get what she wanted because she had a greater mission. So finally she got the approval from Vaucouleurs, where I also went. And from there I went to the Loire Valley, and I basically retraced her route as much as I could, going to the towns on the way, Auxerre, St. Catherine of Fierbois. And that's where she said that her famous sword would be found. And the only problem is she had stayed there and heard Mass several times. So when she sent for it from Chinon, the future king asked her if she knew it was there, and she said no. And so I think that was one of many examples of her fabricating the truth a little bit. But she was determined to get away from home. I think that's one of my findings. To me, I don't use the word easily because my students do, and that's the word awe. Awe that a teenage girl, even if she was helped by the court, could do the things she did. She really did fight. She had 4 major injuries: an arrow wound to the shoulder, 1 to the hip. She stepped on a spike trap. She fell off a ladder when the English threw stones on her head. And she made major leadership decisions. So it was, how can a 17 to a 19-year-old girl do that? It couldn't happen today to the same degree. So I think she became much more than the court planned her to be. But at the same time, Joan was very much Joan, and so when they told her to shut up and go along with the truce, her self-confidence really comes through. And again, where she got that from, I don't know. But she showed that throughout. And when I talked to one of the actresses who portrayed her, Lily Sobieski, she said, you know, since I was her age when I played the part, I think it was just the confidence of youth. You know, as someone my age, you know, I'd be very scared to get on a ski trail or something like that and go down it for the first time. But Joan at 17 seemed not to be afraid of anything. I think she thought she was invincible, and that communicated itself to people around her. She did not try and drag them to church all the time, even though she suggested they go to Mass before fighting. But it's a very different picture than you get from a lot of fiction and a lot of the films that have popularized her story, and even her sainthood, which I think has made her into a don't mess with Joan kind of figure, which I found out a lot. People were not necessarily happy with my interpretation because I wanted to situate her firmly as a girl growing up in the 15th century and having this extraordinary thing happen to her because of her. And in the process to really change the course of the 100 Years' War and change the idea of France. But I think the larger theme is our view of women in history, because I think students come in, and a lot of historians and non-historians repeat the idea that history is always progressive. You know, it started out with women with no rights, and suddenly we all have all the rights. And we know that's not true, but I think one of the things that it really tells me is that history is a zigzag. That at times in history there was definitely a place for very strong women, or in this case a teenage girl, to operate and have a really strong effect on historical events. And so I think it's a good corrective to what we tend to assume about, especially the Middle Ages.